Hello everyone, this is Joe Brewer here, and I thought I would record this presentation because we had technical difficulties the other day, and I wanted to show you the slides. And so let's begin by reminding ourselves that the purpose of this learning journey is that we want to learn how to live into the design pathway for regenerating Earth. And so what we're going to be talking about in this presentation is a bit of the planetary context and how we might go about doing this, just to kick off the learning journey and get us started. And one thing that I want to really emphasize is that this is something I take very personally. This is a photo with my daughter Elise, taken about a year ago when she's just turning 4 years old. And what I want to emphasize is that when I think about the future of humanity, for me, it's very personal. I have a deep love for my daughter, a strong sense of care for her well-being, and a lot of concern about the future as a father. But also, when we chose to have our daughter, we knew that we were looking eyes wide open into a collapsing planetary system and looking at a very dangerous future for children. And so it wasn't idly or by accident that we chose to have a child. It was that we felt the need to put love into the world and into the future. And of course, we wanted to have a child. And so for us, it was a celebration of the possibility that humanity may be better in the future than humanity is today. I also want to say that for my family personally, we've learned how to live regeneratively and have come a long way by finding a place where the landscape and the territory receives us and there's a community that holds us. This photo here is taken from Bioparque Moncura, where I work every day doing landscape regeneration and reforestation work. And there in the distance, you can see the small mountain village of Barichara, where we live in the northern Andes of Colombia. And so for us, it's been a long journey to get to a place that we have this deep of a land connection and so much community around us. And one thing we'll be exploring throughout this learning journey is how did we get to here? What were our lives like? How did we make our decisions? And how might this help you to gain clarity about the decisions you need to make in your life? Now I want to say something that's actually disturbing and may create some grief or some pain or some fear, some negative feelings. But I really want to emphasize that all indicators that take the holistic, dynamic, diverse set of data about the changing planet, all of that together points in a single direction. The human population is an overshoot, that the entire planet is an ecological overshoot, meaning we've gone beyond the carrying capacity of the planet. And the human population is very likely to reach its peak quite soon and then begin a rapid decline. And as human population overshoots and collapses in the coming decades, during the rest of our lives, the unsustainable cultures of the world, including the globalized economy, which is profoundly unsustainable, will become compost for Earth's biosphere. And what I want to say is that the mission of the design school, Earth Regenerators, and of this learning journey is to keep the human population from going to zero during this collapse. Or said another way, we want to avoid human extinction. And so we want to create a design pathway that follows these green dashed lines, where an increasing number of people become regenerators of the Earth and help to stabilize and restore ecological functions while the human population continues its overshoot and collapse. And notice how different this is from trying to keep the human population high and make it sustainable, which is what almost all of sustainability practice today focuses on. Here we're talking about a deep spiritual path where we have to find faith and love and purpose and meaning in the midst of turbulent and dangerous times to continue this mission throughout the coming decades and even into the coming centuries. Now, why do I say that human population is going to overshoot and collapse? Well, that's a longer story, and I want to just give some anecdotal evidence for now to suggest how serious our present predicament is. So one thing is, a lot of people are not familiar with this thing called the Blue Ocean event. The Blue Ocean event is when the Arctic Ocean becomes free of ice during the Northern Hemisphere's summer. And when this happens, what happens is an icy surface that reflects 90% of the sunlight away from the North Pole will be replaced by open ocean liquid water that absorbs 90% of the solar energy that comes in. And because it's at the poles, the north and south poles of the planet are the most sensitive places for climate change, and they become accelerators and amplifiers of the turbulence for the entire planetary climate system. While all of the forecasts suggest to us that the blue ocean event, where we start to have ice-free summers in the northern hemisphere in the Arctic Ocean, is going to happen sometime within the next 5 to 10 years, and this will create an abrupt and irreversible change in planetary climate. And as you can see from this newscast, we actually reached 118 degrees Fahrenheit in the Arctic Ocean last year. And so this blue ocean event is coming, and there's very little at this point that can stop the momentum that is going to bring it to us. Similarly, we're right on the edge of a catastrophic and irreversible collapse of the entire Amazon basin, the world's largest forest, a forest that has existed continuously for 40 million years. For point of reference, there's only been ice on Antarctica for between 24 and 26 million years. So for 15 million years longer, there has been an Amazon rainforest on the South American continent, and that is about to go away. Why do I say this? Because the combination of surface area that is deforested together with the fragmentation of surface area creates a change in the hydrological flows for the entire South American continent that is going to cause the Amazon to collapse. And this is due to something called the biotic pump theory, which we can discuss more at another time. But the important thing to know is that the computer simulations that try to forecast when and how this might occur show that we are very close to a tipping point in the amount of surface area deforested combined with fragmentation of the remaining forest area that suggests that the Amazon will irreversibly collapse and become grassland savanna sometime within the next 5 years. And all indicators of deforestation patterns in South America show that not only are we not slowing it down, we're actually speeding up the deforestation. And the more economic crises and economic hardships there are, the faster the Amazon will fall. So this is something that is already built in to the inertia of our planetary system. Another abrupt climatic shift will be that the ocean current, which is sometimes called the Great Conveyor Belt, which brings warm surface water up the Atlantic all the way up to warm and keep moderate climates across Western Europe and the western part of the Eurasian continent, that as the Greenland ice sheet melts, releasing fresh water into the North Atlantic, there will come a tipping point in which this entire ocean circulation will shut down, and we will stop having the transport of heat from the equator to the poles from the world ocean, which will amplify and increase the warming at the Earth's poles through atmospheric feedbacks. Or said another way, the planetary climate will shift into chaotic turbulence as soon as this occurs. And while we don't know exactly when it will occur, it's very likely to happen within the next 30 to 40 years. So you can see already we have this pattern of multiple abrupt climate changes that are already underway, each of them feeding and cascading into the next, which will cause a disruption to food supply, to global transport and global supply chains, and cause tipping point effects of instability across the entire planetary system. And this is only to do with climate, without talking about other patterns in the globalized economy, like global pandemics, as we're living through the COVID pandemic right now. That these deep interdependencies of the planetary system are built in, they're moving forward and accelerating, and they're effectively unstoppable at this point in time. So we're moving into a very dangerous future where those of us who want to live regeneratively will need to find ways to live within resilient local communities as this planetary context continues amplifying and accelerating. So, something that I want to stress is that as we live into these changes, we're going to face a lot of disruptions. And here is something that happened during the Oregon and California and Washington and British Columbia wildfire season that occurred last year, when one of my personal friends lost their second farm to wildfires. They lost another farm the previous year. So these are people that were doing regenerative agriculture and agroforestry, and their regenerative farming project was destroyed by wildfires. Another Earth Regenerators member was working in a large-scale ecosystem restoration camp in California, where a specific fire, the lava fire as it was called, burned through the forest and burned down their ecosystem restoration efforts, causing them to become overwhelmed with grief and to really have to assess their lives. So this kind of disruption tells us that we need a psychological and a social resilience, a social support system to help us as Earth Regenerators to manage and give love to these land-based projects, knowing that some of them will be destroyed as we do our work. And of course, there are things like this, where there was an offshore oil well that started on fire out in the middle of the ocean. This was something that happened during the summer last year. So what this means is that there are going to continually be catastrophic events, crises, and emergencies, and we have to somehow navigate them and find health and well-being as we do, and stay true to the mission of Earth regeneration. Said directly, this is something I've learned in my own experience. The life of an Earth regenerator is to continue loving, to hold the pain of continuing to love, even as many places that we love get destroyed. And I have a very personal example of this. In this photo, you can see me with my daughter Elise when she's about 1 year old, and we are in a sacred forest in Oregon where my wife and I were married 15 years ago. We got married in a grove of old-growth Douglas fir trees. Well, last year in August, a fire swept through and destroyed this forest and destroyed our sacred place, having a catastrophic effect in our hearts. And somehow we needed to continue doing regenerative work as we grieved about the loss of this sacred place. All of us are going to have sacred places that are at risk, and many of us will experience the loss of those places as we continue living our lives. And this is going to be a very important part of being an Earth regenerator and learning how to live regeneratively, is to hold the pain and stay in the love while things like this occur. A framework I found that really helps me to understand this planetary context better, so that I know how to navigate and stay true to my course, is a framework developed by the Stockholm Resilience Center called Planetary Boundaries, which is a group of Earth system scientists who asked a specific question. Are there any dynamic processes or capacities of the Earth system that are necessary to maintain a planetary scale or globalized economy? And what they discovered is that there are 9 of them, which are listed here. And what they realized was that if even one of these boundary dynamics, these boundary conditions, if even one of them is crossed, the globalized economy becomes unsustainable, untenable, and it goes away. Then they naturally followed up and asked the question, if there are 9 of these planetary boundaries, with the current state of knowledge, how many of them have we crossed? And in 2015, they reported that we've crossed 4 of them. We've already crossed 4, and the globalized economy is in the process of collapsing now. And the 4 that they identified were land system change, which is the destruction of complex ecosystems and replacing them with simpler landscapes like agriculture and urban landscapes, which are ecologically less complex. Then also biogeochemical flows of nitrogen and phosphorus associated with the creation of nitrogen fertilizers for industrial agriculture is another big one. That biosphere integrity, which translates as the loss of biodiversity or the rate of extinction, that this is one that we've already crossed and we're unraveling the world's biosphere. And climate change is one that we've already crossed and is moving into the danger zone. Well, last year, when they updated this work 5 years later, they found that we've actually crossed 2 more. and that currently ocean acidification and freshwater use have been added to the picture. What this tells us is that in order to regenerate the Earth, we need to bring the planetary boundaries back within their safe operating range, which helps us understand the kind of work we need to do as Earth regenerators. We need to end industrial agriculture and replace it with regenerative agriculture and agroecology, that we need to stop the loss of biodiversity. We need to take simplified landscapes and build ecological complexity. We need to manage and slow climate change, while also managing and protecting and increasing the amount of available fresh water and slowing and reversing ocean acidification. You can already see that this is about a lot more than CO2 levels in the atmosphere, and it's going to take a concerted effort unlike anything humans have attempted before. So how do we do this? Well, I found this map to be truly inspiring, ironically, because this is a map of degraded landscapes. And what this map shows is that a full third, about 35% of the entire Earth's land masses is degraded due to human activities. But what's interesting is if you turn that around and say, if this land is degraded, then could we restore it? And what I see is this is a map of regenerative potential. If you live within any of these degraded areas, you could be a positive influence in helping to restore ecological health and well-being to this place. If you don't live in one of these places, you could relocate and move to one of them. This is more than 3 billion hectares of land, more than the size of all of Africa and all of South America combined. We have so much regenerative potential if only we can learn how to see it. And for me, this map is a very helpful visual cue that says we have a lot of work to do, but we have a lot of opportunity to do it. So the question that we need to ask ourselves is, if we want to restore these landscapes, how did they come to be degraded in the first place? And this is a topic we'll explore as we continue in the learning journey. But for now, I want to say that the root cause of all of this planetary destabilization and the risk of human extinction, along with all the risk of extinction for many non-human species, the root cause is what I call runaway cultural evolution. That there's something about human culture that has caused an accumulation and acceleration of this destruction. And that this has emerged as a globalized system of wealth extraction that arose through colonialism and later through other forms of extractive economics in the last 500 years, in the form of empires and civilizations and trade networks, all of which was intensified by the use of fossil fuels. And this entire globalized system that is profoundly unsustainable is in the process of destroying itself. It's dying. It's like cancer that's filled the host, and the host is dying of cancer. And our job is to heal ourselves and be protected from this dying process as we compost this globalized civilization and replace it with what comes next. This is a visual representation of what I have in mind. If we look at the world right now as this combination of diverse human cultures, many of our cultures right now are extractive, and some, mostly indigenous cultures and a few permaculture groups, but some cultures, human cultures, are regenerative. And as the human population crashes and dies off, and as these extractive cultures kill themselves, what we need to do is pass through the evolutionary bottleneck and have enough regenerative cultures survive that humans don't go extinct during the collapse. So how do we do this? How do we organize these regenerative cultures around the world? Briefly, the answer is this. We go to the bioregional scale. Bioregions are territories where a human culture is able to live within the landscape in a fully sustainable way at a local and regional scale. So what we need to do is create networks of bioregional, local living economies. And here's an example of how we might do it for the South American continent, where the two primary organizing patterns of the land of the continent are the Andes mountain range and the Amazon basin. And if we look at these as river systems and as other forms of geographic organization, we can start to build up territorial or bioregional scale regenerative projects and create networks of them across entire continents to make arterial networks of regeneration, each of which is organized locally. and can create trade and exchange and sharing of knowledge and practice from one bioregion to the next. And this is part of living regeneratively, is knowing how to organize ourselves into landscapes that have a fractal nested pattern that move up to continental and planetary scales, but are deeply integrated at the local scale. And this is how we can go about doing it. Said another way, we can create bioregional networks on every continent. One way to do this is to visualize, like these maps do, where are the rivers? How do we organize human cultures around rivers, which is what indigenous cultures did before the globalized economy? How do we go back to that? So that living regeneratively means that humans organize themselves ecologically into landscapes. Well, this is really like what happened in the Dark Ages when there were monasteries that held ancestral wisdom and carried it forward. There were places you could go to escape the mainstream society and all of its violence and destruction, to carry forth with something that was worth preserving. So a key question for us as Earth Regenerators is to ask, what is so important, so sacred that it cannot be lost during this time of collapse, that if we were in the Dark Ages, we would have held and protected in our monasteries? Well, because we're in a different epoch, a different era, monasteries aren't really the right model for us anymore. So let's replace monasteries with the model that does work, which is we need to create regenerative local economies as wisdom holders. And here's an example from where I live in Barichara, Colombia, where we're replanting forest to help cloud formation and bring the hydrological cycles back into balance. We have reforestation efforts in a community park. We're doing work to recharge aquifers up on a ridgeline. We have a forest school that's being run by some local community members. There are various water retention projects on private land. There's a solidarity network of fincas doing regenerative agriculture, and a whole lot more. And when we look across this territory and see these different projects as part of an ecosystem of projects organized into the land, then the wisdom is held in that ecosystem of projects and all of the knowledge and all of the ethics and all of the conscience that is represented by this embodiment. So as we live regeneratively, we need to organize ourselves into ecosystems of projects that are integrated at the territorial and the landscape scale, so that they can emerge as regenerative economies and replace or outlive extractive economies. How does this work in a practical sense? Well, Masanobu Fukuoka, who's been credited as the founder of natural farming from Japan, said this: "It was in an American desert that I suddenly realized that rain does not fall from the heavens. It comes from the ground. Desert formation is not due to absence of rain, but the rain ceases to fall because the vegetation has disappeared. Building a dam in the middle of the desert is like trying to treat only one symptom. But the only way to increase rainfall is to learn how to regenerate old forests. If we understand how ecological processes give rise to life in land, we can regenerate landscapes. And as human beings, we become active agents of this regeneration. This isn't merely theoretical, it has been done. And one of the most famous examples is the Loess Plateau in China, documented by John D. Liu in his documentary Green Gold, where they found in the span of about 20 years that they were able to take an intensely degraded, desertified desert landscape and transform it into green terraces and a center of regenerative agriculture. They did this in 20 years. Now, granted, this was in China. Hundreds of thousands of people did the work, and they figured out lots of creative solutions. But the thing is, examples exist. This has been done, and this really can be done. And here's the thing. We don't need to wait for someone else to do it. We are the ones we have been waiting for. We can do this. So let's go back to this graph I showed at the beginning, where human population and overshoot is going to occur, and we need to put ourselves onto the green line. What I want to stress is that this is extreme. It is anything but normal in human history. It's an aberration. It's something that's never occurred before and may well never occur again. The globalized economy and the exploded human population and the corresponding loss of ecosystems and non-human species. This is an exemplar of unsustainability. So, we are not trying to stop this. It cannot be stopped. Thus, the need to focus on trauma and grief and spiritual and emotional and psychological regeneration, to heal and maintain ourselves as we go through this time. But then where do we look to do the regenerative work? The models to emulate are here. There are models from indigenous cultures for how to manage forests. There are models from permaculture and ecological design that show us how to restore waterways. We need to look for the models of human culture in the pathway, the design pathway of Earth regeneration. There was a body of work done between the early 1970s and the early 1980s after the release of a famous report called Limits to Growth. The group that did this was called the Balaton Group, and this is what they found. They said each agroeconomic region is so unique that the concept of transfer of technology is irrelevant. We don't need to commodify and create universal solutions. What is relevant is the transfer of the capacity to develop technology and institutions, transfer of the capacity to develop them that are consistent with the cultural endowment and resource endowment of each region. Said another way, we need to create bioregional learning centers for each region that are culturally and ecologically appropriate to that place. And as Dana Meadows, the lead author of the Limits to Growth study, said at the end of this period, this was from an essay she wrote in 1983, she said, out came a vision of a number of centers where information and models about resources and the environment are housed. There would need to be many of these centers all over the world, each one responsible for a distinct bioregion. Said another way, each bioregion creates a whole system model for its own regeneration, while actively cultivating exchanges as a planetary network. And so, learning how to live regeneratively and living into the design pathway is to find a place to root ourselves in a bioregion and to have all of the resources that we need to grow and flourish, while that bioregion becomes increasingly healthy and holistically integrated so that our lives are supported while we do it. And this means that as each of us tries to live this way, we need to give love and support to each other. And that's what this learning journey is about, is how we give love and support to each other that we're all going to need as we live through these difficult times. But what is a regenerative life? How do we do this? Now, I created this diagram not to be comprehensive, but to be evocative, to help us start to think more clearly. And here I identify a few key elements of a regenerative life. The first one is we need a circulation of material flow. We need recycling and reintegration and reuse in ways that are sustainable. We also need cooperation among humans and non-human ecology across entire landscapes. We need this all to be organized around the ecological connections of these landscapes. While we all increasingly become liberated from the debt slavery system that forces us to work and serve wealth extractors in the globalized economy, we have to become liberated. All the while healing our cultural traumas and strengthening our abilities to be in healthy relationships, so that we can cultivate relationships that are sacred and not be harmed by their destruction, but instead be held and supported by protecting and strengthening them. This means we become more fully human, and we become the seeds of culture for the future indigenous peoples, the cultures that function like the indigenous of the past, but in the changed future that we're moving into, that we live as regenerative cultures, living in landscapes organized at the territorial scale, inspired by the past indigenous to create indigenous lifeways for the future. So you can see that living regeneratively is a wholesale transformation of who we are, and it's going to take a lot of work. So how are we going to do this? Well, the overall path of the learning journey in the next 8 weeks is that we will increasingly map out what it means to live regeneratively. that we will create support structures for each other to learn how to do this and practice together, that we will help each other make decisions and take actions throughout this learning journey and beyond. And of course, the kickoff webinar that just occurred will be followed by 3 community Zoom calls, and this pattern will repeat every single week. And we're going to have an online platform on Earth Regenerators where we can do this. And so when we go to the course page for Living into the Design Pathway, the key difference is we're using the one that has the number 2 before the title, because these images are from the first time that we ran this learning journey last year. But otherwise, everything else will remain the same. This is just to help you navigate the online platform to be able to access course content and participate in our activities. That when you go to the course, which is on the left menu, you'll see courses, and click on number 2, Living into the Design Pathway, you'll be taken to a landing page for the course that looks something like this. What you want to look for is that there's an activity feed you can click on to see all of the current activities and what's going on in the learning journey. You'll see a table of contents for homework activities and course materials that we'll be publishing on a weekly basis throughout the whole 8 weeks. I'm about to publish the first of these. You'll also see that you can find other members in the learning journey and connect directly with them to have conversations and go deeper and become friends. There's also the events place. The events section is where you'll find the links to the community calls and the webinars to be able to join them each week. And of course, you can find members up here in the chat. So go up to the chat and type in the name of a member, and you can connect with them directly. And of course, we have our host team that'll be helping guide us through this. So if you see any of these lovely people, we will be hosting the community calls. We're available to help you navigate. We can help you connect to resources in the Earth Regenerators community. Reach out to any of us, and we're here to help. Also, just letting you know that one of the key places in Earth Regenerators to move from talk to action is the Regenerative Project Incubator, which has a set of activities like advisory circles for projects, teach-ins on different topics, design sessions to solve problems together, and they meet regularly and are very active. So if you find that you want to move into deeper action than this learning journey allows, go and join the Project Incubator at any time. And that's it. I would say let's talk, except I'm recording this for you to see it. So I just wanted you to know that this is the presentation I would have given, and I'd love to hear your thoughts and reflections in the comment thread below. Thank you so much, and I'm so glad you're here. Onward, fellow humans.